Today, Baltimore is one of the East Coast's major metropolitan areas. It is home to more than 500,000 Americans and 2 major league sports teams. In this virtual field trip, we're going to visit 3 sites in the Baltimore area related to the War of 1812. We're going to visit Hampton House National Historic Site. We're also going to go to the Star-Spangled Banner House, where the large flag that flew over this fort was made. But we're going to start here at Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine to learn a little bit more about the War of 1812. By 1812, Charm City was the 3rd largest city in the United States, with a population of 47,000. But long before Europeans began settling here, this area that we know as the Chesapeake Bay was home to Native Americans who hunted and fished here. The Europeans began showing up in the 1630s, and in 1706, the Port of Baltimore was officially established to help promote trade. The city of Baltimore was established in 1729 and grew rapidly due to its prominence in the trade of tobacco, grain, and unfortunately, enslaved Africans. As a sign of the city's importance, the Continental Congress met here during the Revolutionary period, and for a brief time, Baltimore was the capital of the United States. During the American Revolution, a small earthen star fort known as Fort Whetstone was constructed at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor along the Patapsco River. Although the fort was never attacked during the war, military experts saw the value in defending the nation's 3rd largest city. In 1798, construction began to improve the fort with brick and stone. The fort was completed in 1803 and was called Fort McHenry, named after James McHenry, George Washington's Secretary of War. For the next 10 years, the fort will serve as protection for the Charm City and an imposing installation over the Patapsco River. It's not until 1814, in the heart of the War of 1812, that Fort McHenry is going to take on increased prominence in American history. The War of 1812 is probably America's most overlooked war. It was fought between the United States and Great Britain, and it started, you guessed it, in 1812. Now, when the war began, the British and their allies were still embroiled in a war against Napoleon Bonaparte in France. So the United States was able to score some early victories, especially on the water and on the Canadian border. By this point in the war, however, the British have mopped up their fighting against Napoleon, and elite veteran troops who had fought in Europe are now ready to fight in the United States. In the late summer of 1814, the British set their sights on the Chesapeake Bay. They capture Washington, D.C., and as retribution for the American violence in Canada, they burn the White House and the Capitol. With the Capitol in flames, the eyes of the nation turned here to Baltimore, where in September of 1814, the British landed 5,000 troops just east of the city. More troublesome, however, was the powerful armada that sailed into Baltimore Harbor, prepared to bombard the fort behind me into submission. The resulting fight gave us one of the most lasting legacies of the War of 1812, our national anthem. We're going to head inside the fort and learn a little bit more about this perilous fight. I'm joined now by Shannon McLucas of Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine. Shannon, what were the British trying to accomplish here during the late summer of 1814?
Well, actually, when the British were here, they'd arrived initially in the spring of 1813, and they essentially were opening up another front in the War of 1812. So the Chesapeake Campaign will last from the spring of 1813 with the burning of Havre de Grace all the way through the fall of 1814. And so here at Fort McHenry, the battle begins, or the preparations for the big battle begin way before the actual bombardment itself. So in the spring of 1813, when the British arrive, their mission is to essentially occupy the Chesapeake Bay and destroy as much as possible. Essentially, the idea behind this is to make sure that the Americans can't bring additional resources away from the Canadian front to reinforce the Chesapeake. And this is also going to hurt American trade, and once they get to the capital, of course, it's going to hurt American morale. So it's essentially a campaign of terror. They would randomly raid farms, burn smaller towns. They show up in a variety of places. So for Baltimoreans, being in the 3rd largest city in the United States, for them it wasn't a question of, will this battle take place, will the British arrive? It's, when is it going to happen and how do we get ready for it? So when the British arrive in the Patapsco River just outside of Baltimore in 1814, they've already burned the city of Washington. They've already burned Havre de Grace. They've burned Alexandria, or actually they ransomed Alexandria. But several different cities have suffered. And so for Baltimoreans, this is a time to make their stand, because They know full well what's going to happen. If the British make it through this part of the Tapsco River, if they make it past Fort McHenry, they're certainly going to destroy the homes and businesses and the port of Baltimore. So for here, this is where Baltimoreans have to take their stand. And fortunately, what happens is that the commanders here, Samuel Smith, Major George Armistead, they're able to pull the community together and bring a variety of defenders to the city.
So when we talk about Baltimoreans defending Fort McHenry, who exactly is defending the fort?
Well, the wonderful thing about this is it's not just Baltimoreans. We have folks coming in from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey, from Delaware, from Virginia. These sister states are coming in to defend the third largest city in the United States and one of the major ports. That said, you do have Baltimoreans and local militia units who are serving here. So you have the Washington Artillery, you have the Baltimore Fencibles, and we'll see a little bit more about them. And then you have several infantry divisions that are sent here to circle the dry moat, just in case there's a British landing. If the Royal Marines make it ashore, the infantry is there to prevent that. On the lower batteries and the upper water batteries, you have sailors from the United States Chesapeake Flotilla, and then you have detachment of Sea Fencibles, who are actually sailors who served under Army commanders. And then so you have the Corps of Artillery, militia units, the Navy. They're all brought together. When you get into Baltimore, you have a great variety of defenders, including infantry, and also Marines who happen to be in town. So essentially, this is when you have multiple forces combining their efforts, and George Armistead is responsible for coordinating all of that.
And all told, how many people are defending the fort?
There are about 1,000 men here.
Very cool. Now we're looking at the fort. It's a brick and mortar fort. What would the fort have looked like in 1812?
In 1812, by that point, we would have had the main Star Fort constructed, so the 5 bastions, and then 5 buildings inside that were all a single story. And then you would have had some upper and lower water batteries constructed by 1814, and we'll see those a little bit later on. Those are just one at the fort's elevation and another one closer to the river. So you have a series of batteries, all told about 56 guns or so, scattered throughout different parts of the fort. So essentially the pentagonal fort and the interior buildings and the water batteries.
We're now going to take a walk around the fort and meet some of the defenders. So I'm standing now in the dry moat outside of Fort McHenry, and I'm joined by Tim Ertel, who's going to talk a little bit about the defenders of the fort. So Tim, first of all, what are you wearing?
United States Regular Infantry uniform.
Very cool. And now which units were represented here at the fort?
So here in the dry moat specifically was the 38th Infantry, 36th Infantry, 14th, and the 12th United States Infantry of 600 men. Under Lieutenant William Stewart.
Now, these are all regular U.S. Army troops?
All regular U.S. Army, and they would just arrive right before the battle. The Chesapeake Flotilla, who would be on the water battery, and the infantry would get here just in time. And the idea is that they were behind the fort, so that if the British did land, they could bring them around to engage.
Now, had these troops fought elsewhere during the war at this point?
Yes, oh absolutely. Bladensburg, a lot of them were veterans of Bladensburg.
What are some of the stories that come out from these regiments of the men fighting or waiting here in this dry moat?
So one in specific, among them was an escaped slave named Frederick Hall, and he would join the 38th U.S. Infantry under the alias of William Williams. And he would, the enlistment officer would sign him up with no questions, and he would put him on the rosters as having freckles and fair skin, so he would get in. Escaped slaves or slaves were not allowed to join the regular army, so he was hoping to save his freedom and then to preserve his country.
And so he just kind of gets away with it?
So, no, unfortunately, 6:30 a.m. the bombs and rockets start falling on September 13th, and a bomb will burst and shrapnel will hit his leg, and then he will be taken to Baltimore, and about 2 months later he'll die in the hospital.
But that's from here, fighting at Fort McHenry or waiting to defend the fort against the British bombardment.
Right.
So Tim, I want to start with something that seems a little bit kind of catches my eye is that all of these musicians are wearing red coats. I thought red coats was the uniform of the British Army. What's going on here?
Exactly. The U.S. Army, unfortunately, decided that red was going to be the color for the musicians. So if the officers are on the other side of the barracks and they need to find the musician, they can scan the parade and the garrison quickly, and they can pick out that musician to sound that call, whether it's sergeant's call or assembly or any call that they need to be done right away.
So it's really all just for the convenience of the officers?
Their convenience. So when it came time to battle, usually the musicians went to the rear to assist surgeons and such.
So Tim, what role did music play in the soldiers' lives during the War of 1812?
So they regulated the day from sun up to sundown. From reveille to tattoo, the musicians would wake the soldiers up. They tell them when to go eat, when to go to sleep, when to march out to drill. So they regulated the day. Very important. That's why we made $1 more a month.
Oh, I'm sure that, so that dollar, in addition to that $1 more a month, is there any other reason that the soldiers might resent the musicians from waking them up? Is there any
That was mainly it. From waking them up. A lot of the veterans, especially in the Civil War, would return and they would hear that reveille and those calls and those sounds that just brought it all back to them, those memories. So. Yeah.
So how does one get to be a musician in the Army during the War of 1812?
So the regular Army had forts like Governor's Island here at Fort McHenry. Early in 1813, the regular infantry had musicians' schools for the regular Army. But a lot of the militia, they came with musical talent. So if they were young enough and they had the rudiments and could play drum and they could learn fife quickly, that's all they would do, drill. And they would learn, the Army adopted Charles Ashworth's War of 1812 manual with all those duty calls, marching music, Yankee Doodle, all those national airs.
So what? So you say national airs. What exactly does that mean?
That means ceremonial music when the flag goes up, when the flag comes down, when somebody important comes in, hail to the chief. That's all in the manuals. Yankee Doodle, of course, here was played at Fort McHenry when the flag went up that morning, September 14th at 9 a.m. 1814. So
very cool. I didn't know that. So next time you think you hear Yankee Doodle, don't just think of it as this old tune from the Revolutionary War. Think of it as the song going on while the flag is going up here at Fort McHenry. Now the musicians, we tend to have this image of the little drummer boy, some young kid. How old were musicians during the War of 1812?
Anywhere 15, 16 years old. Yeah, we have George Schellenberger was on the water battery from the Corps of Artillery during the bombardment there, and when they started firing, they did play Yankee Doodle right at the water battery. So,
well, what was the age of enlistment at the time for the regular Army?
So from 18 to 35 was the typical age, and then you had some that were recorded in their 50s and 60s in the regular Army.
So the idea of a 7 or 8 year old boy with a drum is just not realistic.
Not going to happen.
So we're now here in the enlisted men's barracks, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the equipment that the men carried during the War of 1812. So Tim, what do we have here on this table?
So here we have a set of 1808 leathers. You have your cartridge box. It's got 26 rounds in it. Down below, they're going to keep extra flints, and then a cloth to wipe out their frizzen and their pan to keep it dry, and then your musket tool. And here's a sample of a round. It's a 69 caliber, 125 grains of powder. And then here's your 1795 Springfield. So very similar to those used in the Revolutionary War, not much different. Again, with this pan, you're going to have failures to spark, and then a flash in the pan. So there's 2 misfires that you could have. So they're not very reliable. Your flint can fall out very easily, so you got to keep it tight right here.
So can you explain the flintlock mechanism and sort of how it works?
Right, correct. So the flint, once they pour the powder into the pan, okay, you're going to shut the frizzen, okay, and then once you cock this hammer back, okay, the flint's going to strike the steel, you're going to get a spark, it's going to go in the vent, and it will ignite that powder, sending that 69 caliber ball effective up to 80 yards.
So everything on this table is really about the weapon and firing the weapon.
Exactly.
What about the things that they wore and the things that they carried?
So yes, they're issued, basically their knapsack, that's a Larbet knapsack, 1808, it's a double bag. So they're going to get issued a blanket, that's it, and then extra shirt, linen, a work shirt. So I'm going to wear this over top of this uniform, so when I'm on fatigue duty, I'm not going to mess up my uniform.
Wait a second. You're wearing all of this wool, and then when you're working, you're going to put on...
I'm going to put this over top. So there's a fatigue blouse. Right. You know, got to have more. Linen trousers. You got to have extra socks. And then in the wintertime, so right about now, November, right? We're going to have wool trousers, and then your woolen waistcoat. And then we're all wearing fatigue caps. So you have two caps. So when we're on work duty, we're wearing a fatigue cap, and then this lovely Shako. They call it a brain cooker. It's not very comfortable, but it makes you look taller. So if I'm a shorter soldier, you know, with this palm and this Shako, it's going to make them look intimidating as you're approaching the enemy, and that's the idea.
And it's made of all leather, that Shako.
That's all leather. Now let's look at the plate. So what you have is an eagle, okay, and you have a yellow cord, and you have a artillery piece, an eagle. So that shows U.S. artillery. So artillery, you would have yellow trim on the coatees, and brass buttons. If I was infantry, it'd be white trim, white buttons, and white buckles, such. So,
which is different from today's military, where infantry is light blue and artillery is red.
Right. So everything this is War of 1812. So here, this is the living room, dining room, and kitchen of 1812. Everything they did was in these barracks. They would cook in the fireplace. They would polish their buttons. Again, using button boards from their knapsack. This is their footlocker, as I said. You have your shaving, your razor, your comb, letter writing materials. This is all personal items and effects. Cards, they weren't allowed to gamble, but they did, of course.
About how many men would be in this barracks?
So 20 per room. So in Captain Evans' Corps of Artillery, you had 74 men approximately, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, 2 musicians. And they would wake up 5:30 a.m. to reveille. So there was a routine. And they stuck to that routine, 5:30 a.m. reveille. And then from there, you would have a fatigue call to get wood and water to then make breakfast. Then there's a breakfast call. And then after that, there's the parade, inspection, orders of the day. The sergeant would take the muster rolls to the adjutant, the morning reports. And then you have musket drill in the morning. And then roast beef is played at noon. Then in the afternoon, after lunch, they would have artillery drill all day and drill on the great guns. And then once they drill on the great guns, they come back, and then they have their evening meal, and then tattoo about 9 p.m., and then lights out at 10 o'clock, and then next day they start all over again at 5:30.
So I have to ask, because we know that I'm sure every student you've ever encountered in this space has asked this question, where do these guys go to the bathroom?
Well, it's very convenient. So this building is right next to Bastion 4. It's in Bastion 4.
So they actually had like a designated restroom?
Designated privy is in Bastion 4, and guess what's below it? The well. Brilliant, right?
So now that we've learned a little bit more about the soldier life, let's explore some more of the fort. So we're now inside the officers' quarters at Fort McHenry. And Shannon, what role does the fort play in the Battle of Fort McHenry?
Well, you notice when you arrived here that Fort McHenry is situated at the end of a peninsula that juts out from South Baltimore. And so just by that peninsula, you find the channel of the Patapsco River. Now, the Patapsco River is the lifeline of Baltimore's industry. It's the port. And so that channel is the only way to get to downtown Baltimore, to the actual city itself. Now, Fort McHenry was constructed here as part of the Coastal Defense Act of 1794. And so the fort is the one site that the Royal Navy will have to get past in order to get into Baltimore. And so this is actually the one place that needs to be protected. So we think of Fort McHenry in the defense of Baltimore, but if you consider all of the other preparations that go into preparing the defense of a considerably large city at that point. You have what we consider the harbor defenses. So Fort McHenry is a part of that. It's a major part of that with 1,000 defenders here. But you also have, just across the river, the Lazaretto Battery. So some additional gun batteries there, several sunken ships. So basically just merchant ships that were sunk to the bottom of the Patapsco River to block, create another obstacle for a British ship if it wants to make its way up the channel. And so we also have several gun barges beyond that. So as I told you when we started this, that Baltimoreans had been preparing. They really had started to think through, they assessed the needs of the city. So what do we have? Let's look at our geography and how can we defend it? So Fort McHenry is a big part of that. And George Armistead, of course, the commander of the fort, he's not only responsible for Captain Evans and his artillerists. George Armistead is actually the superintendent of the harbor defenses. So he's responsible for coordinating the efforts of the Army, the Navy. He's going to have to deal, of course, with the Committee of Vigilance and Safety, and those are the civilians funding the defense of Baltimore. Somebody's got to pay the bills, right? So he has to coordinate all of those efforts and pull all of those men, all the material, everything that you need to successfully defend the city. That's his responsibility.
And that's all administered from this building that we're in right now?
Yeah. It's most of it is, there's a lot of things going downtown. There are, of course, messages traveling down to Baltimore to Major General Sam Smith, who is overall in command of the defenses of Baltimore. He's the one who's really coordinating everything, including Hampstead Hill to the eastern edge of the city. But he's working very closely with George Armistead, who's here. Now, tell us a little bit about Armistead himself. Where does he come from, and how did he get this command? Okay, well, he's actually from Virginia. A lot of the folks who have studied the Civil War will have heard the name Armistead before. He's the uncle of the Armistead you hear about at Gettysburg. And so the family's from Virginia along the Rappahannock River. Armistead is going to join the U.S. Army. He's an officer in the Corps of Artillery. He serves on the Niagara campaign, and because he acquits himself very well, he's commissioned major and sent down here to prepare the defenses of Baltimore. So it does speak very highly to his abilities that he was tasked with, ultimately, when we think about it, the lives of 50,000 residents are on his shoulders. That's the responsibility that he bears when it comes to this battle. After this bombardment, he's exhausted. He actually collapses. It isn't until about 2 weeks later that he makes his after-action report to the Secretary of War, then James Monroe. And so that fatigue does wear on him for the rest of his life. He remains the commanding officer of Fort McHenry. He's actually brevetted lieutenant colonel. So the statue you saw just outside our visitor center says Colonel George Armistead. He is there for the laying of the cornerstone of the battle monument that you see on Calvert Street. You'll also see it on every Baltimore City flag, because that's our icon. But George Armistead will only, unfortunately, live 4 more years, and so he dies at the very young age of 38. Of natural causes. We're not certain entirely what it was, but we do know that his health was never fully recovered after this bombardment. So if you can imagine the weight of an entire city's fate on your shoulders, it would be quite an ordeal.
Now, when we talked about the defenders earlier, we mentioned that it was mentioned that they were commanded by a lieutenant colonel, and Armistead is a major, so he's outranked by his infantry supports. How does he navigate these different commands that he has under his authority? That's
a good question. He is appointed as superintendent of the harbor defenses, and so those infantrymen, when they report, when Lieutenant Colonel Stewart reports to Fort McHenry, he knows that he is under overall command of Major George Armistead. He also has to deal with, when you think about it, folks in the fort, those defenders are going to include also local militia units. And if you can imagine regular army and militia units interacting, personalities don't always work really well. So a lot of it is going to be diplomacy on his part. But those men, when they report if they're assigned to a harbor defense post, it's with the understanding that he's the man in charge.
Now, in the room that we're sitting right now, is this pretty much how it would have looked during the War of 1812, or is it based off of a later period?
No, this is based off the War of 1812. The building we're actually in used to be the junior officers' quarters. So you would have had Captain Frederick Evans and his lieutenants in this building. Next door was the commanding officers' quarters. So George Armistead had one building to himself, but it had an office very much like this. So You know, if you're gathering around maps, if you're trying to assess the needs, if you're trying to write up orders, draft correspondence, it's in a room like this.
And is this room generally open to the public when they're here?
Typically, usually we have someone doing costumed interpretations. Sometimes we have some rangers come in and just sit down and talk with visitors. It's a nice informal way to just chat and to be also in the rooms themselves, to feel more like you're in the War of 1812 era instead of just looking at an exhibit. It's a little different when you're actually living in the space.
Of course, the action at Fort McHenry impacted more than just the defenders and Francis Scott Key. The fort was built to protect the entire city of Baltimore and, by extension, the farms and plantations in the surrounding countryside. We're going to head over to Hampton National Historic Site to learn about the civilian side of the War of 1812. Like many coastal cities of the colonial era, Baltimore owed its prominence to the nearby farms and plantations, which supplied goods that were highly sought after in European markets. Hampton National Historic Site was one of those plantations, and at one point it sprawled to more than 25,000 acres. The showpiece of the property was Hampton Hall, and when it was completed in 1790, it was most likely the largest private home in the United States. Today, the staff at Hampton National Historic Site preserve the historic structure and the surrounding property. But more importantly, they tell the story of the lives of the people who lived here and worked here, who made Baltimore and by extension the United States the country it is today. So obviously, Hampton was here during the War of 1812. We were not far from Baltimore. Does this place play any role in the Battle of Fort McHenry?
Well, not in the battle directly, but if we think about those things that made the battle possible, absolutely. The Northampton Iron Works that was owned by the Ridgely family, they made much of their fortune during the Revolutionary period earlier on when they were supplying iron for the military. And during the War of 1812, Governor Ridgely is going to, well, not yet governor, but Charles Carnan Ridgely will do that as well. The Northampton Iron Works provides, again, iron for the military. So when you think about anything you'll need for shot or bombs or something like that, they're providing that that iron. And actually, after the War of 1812, the Ridgely family was gifted two bombs that were duds from the bombardment of Fort McHenry. It starts with 1,500 acres. Those were purchased back in 1745, and the house you'll see here will become the summer residence for Captain Charles Ridgely, who was a merchant in Baltimore. So when you think about the city of Baltimore and the way it develops through the port, Captain Charles Ridgely is an example of that. He's going to take the acreage he has here and eventually build Northampton Iron Works, which is just a few miles, well, the foundations are a few miles from where we're standing now. And this estate will actually grow up to 25,000 acres at its height in 1829, and then it will dwindle over time. So now we have about 62 acres of a park. But it begins back there with 1,500 acres in 1745, and several generations of the family will live here up to 1948.
Wow. So when did they decide to build this magnificent house behind us?
Well, they started it in 1783. As I said, they have a place in Ridgely's Delight in Baltimore, and Captain Ridgely decides he wants a summer place, a nice, quiet, small summer place. And so in 1783, he meets with Jehu Howell, who is a local builder. He wasn't an architect per se, but he did help design. He did design the house. Ridgely had some ideas for what he wanted it to look like. And so between 1783 and 1790, you have a combination of enslaved African Americans, indentured servants, and over 22 skilled carpenters who begin building Hampton Hall.
And how long did it take them to build this thing?
It takes about 7 years for the completion of the house. And then the gardens, of course, are another development during that period.
And for the architecturally interested people, what style is the home?
Okay, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because Hampton is the first national park site that's actually preserved based on its architectural merit. This is an example of Georgian architecture, but like any kind of American style, it has a few other influences thrown in there. So it is a Georgian style home, but when you look at it, you can see at the top of the dormer windows, and you see the scrolling and some of the more intricate work, and as well as the cupola. They have a more Baroque influence, and then there are some Palladian influences. The stucco on the facade is a Palladian influence. So we have a nice mixture it's a quintessential American design. Basically, you take a lot of different things from European styles, blend them together, and create an entirely new thing.
What would this site have looked like, say, during the War of 1812?
Well, during the War of 1812, you actually would have seen a similar landscape out front here, and then the gardens on the back, you would have also seen these falling terrace gardens. And You'd find a lot of a similar landscape from what we're seeing now. The neighborhood that's developed around us, of course, that wasn't here. So instead of where those neighborhoods are located, you would have seen essentially fields stretching out for miles and miles.
Now, it's easy to stand here and think about the architecture and the opulence and just the sheer wealth of this place and overlook how this wealth was acquired and how the property made a name for itself. So let's talk a little bit about the enslaved people and how they relate to Hampton.
Of course. When we think about Hampton, we look at two very different worlds, but they're related. They're very, very connected in many ways, even just through daily life. And so when we look at this house, as I mentioned, it was actually constructed by, through the work of indentured servants and enslaved African Americans. The wealth that was necessary to have this home built came from their work in the Northampton Iron Works. So the men who worked in the Northampton Iron Works, those who worked in the fields, they were all enslaved African Americans. And so while you're here at Hampton, in addition to that opulence that you see and everything we've seen in the house, one of the wonderful things to do is to connect with these worlds, and we can do that here. We're fortunate enough to have the slave quarters and many of the old farm structures just across the street.
Now, when people think of plantations and they think of slave labor, they tend to think of agricultural slaves. What kind of slaves were here at Hampton?
Well, that's not uncommon. Frequently people do think of only agriculture, but as you explore Hampton, you'll actually find out about the lives of those enslaved persons who worked in highly skilled trades, those who worked as cooks, those who worked in the iron works as furnace workers. The people who helped Hampton to exist in every single way, many of them were enslaved African Americans, and they came with a variety of skill sets.
At its height, how many slaves were there here at Hampton?
Well, we know that there were about 350 at its height in 1829. It dwindles from there partially because the governor Governor Ridgely, who dies in 1829, has 11 children, and so his estate begins to split up from there just through inheritance. So he parcels out his estate, and with that estate, of course, during that time period, people were considering, enslaved persons were a part of the estate and could be inherited. So that's going to shift where the labor force is. It's also going to cut back on the amount of land owned by the owner of Hampton Hall.
So give us just a couple of the must-see things here at Hampton.
Well, the must-see that most people would recommend is to take a tour of the mansion. We do guided tours throughout the mansion to get you into each of those rooms that we'll explore. Another thing that people really enjoy doing is just taking a stroll around the grounds. If you look at our brochure, it'll tell you all about the different types of plants that you find here, the formal gardens, the landscape itself, and then while you're at it, take a stroll past all of the different buildings that support this estate. So we have the domestic buildings off just behind you, as well as the stables, and then when you cross over the street, there's the farm property, and there you'll find the lower farmhouse, you'll find the dairy, the mule barn, and then of course the slave quarters that are still intact. It's unusual to have slave quarters that are still in such good condition, but we do, and there are many stories to be told on that side of the park.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Let's go check out some other parts of the site. I'm joined now by Park Ranger Jimmy Horn. Jimmy, Hampton is a working plantation. What exactly does that mean?
So the Hampton Mansion was a summer home for the Ridgeleys. But more than that, this was also a place that made money for the family. So a working plantation, you actually had a large population of labor, both enslaved and indentured, working for the family, doing things like growing agricultural products, raising livestock, working in the ironworks, doing all these industries that had the sole purpose of making the Ridgely family really, really rich.
So what sort of products were they growing here?
So they were growing all sorts of things. One of the original products that they wanted to grow when they got the property was tobacco. They were growing corn, basically your typical farm style here, just on a much larger scale. We're also going to have orchards, so there's going to be tons of trees planted on the property, where you're going to have, things like apples that you're going to grow. And what's kind of interesting about, the orchards are it actually becomes a really easy way to get children involved in working on the plantation, because when that fruit falls from the trees, children can just pick that up and put it in a basket. They don't have to worry about climbing anything, picking anything. It falls to the ground and they pick it up.
Now, we're not talking about the Ridgely children picking up this fruit now, are we?
No, absolutely not. That's going to be enslaved children, that peculiar institution of slavery here in the United States. So they'd actually take enslaved people into the mansion here at Hampton, and they would have wedding ceremonies for those enslaved people. And on the surface, that seems really nice. You get to have these people have a nice, beautiful house that they're having their weddings in. But it's actually for a more specific purpose. You want to encourage your enslaved people to get married so that they can have children, and you can then own those children. You can have more slaves that you own that way.
So where are we standing right now on the property?
So right now we're on what's called the farm side of the modern day park of Hampton National Historic Site. This is just one part of what have been the larger working plantation. This is really the meat of the plantation. So on the mansion side, you have that nice, beautiful mansion, that beautiful facade, but all the work that is being done to maintain that level of wealth is being done at different sites throughout the plantation that are like this, where there are slave quarters, where there are overseer houses, right around where all the fields would have been that all this work is happening.
So we have these two stone structures right here. Those are slave quarters?
These are slave quarters. These are original slave quarters. Very rare today that you get to see standing slave quarters, and very specifically that you get to see stone slave quarters.
Yeah, I was noticing that, when you think of slave quarters, if they are still standing, there's really not much to see, or not much in the way of architecture here. But we have these stone slave quarters. What's the story behind that?
So originally, the slave quarters that would have been in this area would have been what you think of more typically when it comes to slave quarters, wood buildings, maybe not being kept up as well. But what's unique about these slave quarters is we're actually in view of that mansion. And what Eliza originally did at one point after she traveled across Europe, she fell in love with the French countryside, and she specifically loved the idea of a little French villa. And she looked down from the mansion and she saw slave quarters that were down here that were falling apart. And she thought, that's not a really nice view. I'd much prefer to have that view that I saw in France of having my own little French villa. So she has these stone buildings constructed, not to give better structure for enslaved people to live in, but because she wanted a better view.
So it's a lot like the marriages in that way. On the surface, it seems like a nice thing, these stone structures, but in fact, it's really just for her benefit at this case. So we have another building over here, and that's this wooden structure. What is that?
So that's what we call by several different names. At times we call it the farmhouse. Other times we call it the overseer's house. It has a lot of different purposes throughout the history of the Hampton plantation. There's a small section of it that is actually the start of the Ridgeleys on this property. It's one of the oldest buildings in Baltimore County. It's the building that they put here when they initially decide to get this land and start farming. It's not until they discover iron on the property, they start selling that iron, that they make enough money that they're going to move into the larger house. They're going to decide to build that mansion. Now, this building goes through a lot of different stages, a lot of different expansions. Like I said, it's going to be used as an overseer's house. The overseer would live right down here with the enslaved people, keeping an eye on them, on the work that's being done. And eventually, over time, after the mansion is sold to the National Park Service, 2 members of the Ridgely family that were living in the mansion are going to move right back into this house where it all started.
And I notice on top of that overseer's building, there is a bell there. What is that for?
Yeah, so bells are very important on this site for the laborers for different signals. In the mansion, you talk about the bells there, tell people that there's a specific need in a specific room. The bell that's on top of this farmhouse, on top of the overseer's house, that is the signal to all the workers on this plantation, both for the start of the day and the end of the day. So you are living your day-to-day life on the sound of that bell. That bell tells you when you're going to need to work and when you need to stop working.
So we know a lot about what happened to the Ridgely family. What happened to the slaves who worked here?
So there's a lot of different places where the enslaved people from the Hampton plantation end up. We've actually just completed a 3-year ethnographic study based on that, of learning not only about the enslaved people that were here, but what happens after Hampton. So for a lot of them, they end up moving to places like East Towson. Some of them move up to Pennsylvania. There are some who transition from slavery in 1864 over into paid laborers. So these slave quarters here, some of the people that were living there as slaves are suddenly transitioning to living there as paid laborers. They end up all over the place, and we've been fortunate enough that we've been able to track a lot of their descendants, and a lot of them still live in the relative area. Some of them live in Philadelphia, some of them live in Baltimore, and some of them live in Maryland, just scattered throughout.
So for those who stayed on the property, what was their relationship like with the Ridgely family afterwards?
We do have the story of a woman by the name of Nancy Davis. She moved away from the plantation initially after she gained her freedom, but she actually comes back to the plantation, and she helps raise a lot of the Ridgely family children. And she's so adored by the Ridgely family that when she's died, she's actually buried in the family cemetery. Now, that's one case. She's a very unique case, but it's very prominent to think that they thought that highly of her, that they buried her in the family cemetery.
So we're surrounded by, these very real, tangible evidences of slavery in the United States. Why do we keep these buildings? Why should people come and learn about this really unsavory part of American history?
Well, it really goes back to when you look at the preamble of the Constitution, right? They talk about wanting to, in order to preserve a more perfect union. We've never been a perfect union. And one of the original blemishes of this country is the institution of slavery. And the best way to learn from those blemishes is to visit places like this. You see the tragedy that occurred here, the hardships that occurred here, and you learn from that. And you learn how to come together and how you can move forward to not make those mistakes again.
I hope you're enjoying this virtual field trip to Baltimore. What you're seeing here is just a fraction of the video we shot on our trips to this historic city. Click the links below to learn more about these historic sites. Now on with the rest of the tour. Now, not every family in the Baltimore area was as well off as the Ridgeleys. We're going to move downtown to Pratt Street to the Star-Spangled Banner Flag House, where we're going to learn about Mary Pickersgill, a woman who made her wealth with her own hands. With places like Hampton producing boatloads of goods for shipping overseas, Baltimore itself began booming, bringing in large numbers of people to live in the city. I'm standing outside of 844 East Pratt Street, which was the home of one of those people, Mary Young Pickersgill. Mary was born in 1776 in Philadelphia, just 5 months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. 2 years later, her father died, and her mother, Rebecca, began making flags for the Continental Army in the pattern established by Betsy Ross. Fast forward 30 years. Mary's own husband, John, died in 1805, and like her mother, Mary turned to flag making to support herself and her family. She was living here in 1813 with her mother and her daughter when she received an assignment that would make her the Betsy Ross of the War of 1812. We're going to head on inside the house and check it out. Now, as we enter the house today, we're entering through the kitchen, which is decorated to look how any kitchen would have looked in the beginning part of the 19th century. Now, as we move through the rest of the house, to our modern eyes, this might seem like a small house. In fact, some of you might even have to duck coming through this hallway here. But a house like this would have been common among successful middle-class people, and that is exactly who Mary Pickersgill was. We're talking about a woman in her 30s operating a successful business, which is not something we think of in the 19th century. Now we come here to her office where she would have conducted that business. We see a writing desk in the corner over there, and then next to it on the table, a facsimile of the original order that she was given to make the Star-Spangled Banner. This is an important flag made by a successful businesswoman. We see, in fact, another status symbol on top of the mantle, a portrait of Mary. And again, in the 19th century, if you can afford to have a portrait made of yourself, you're somebody worth making a portrait of, and somebody who can afford it, or at least somebody who can afford it wants to have a portrait of you. So that is Mary right there. On the table here, we see a replica of what is meant to be the Star-Spangled Banner, a large flag. And you can probably guess just from the size of the heap of fabric on that table that it is a large flag. Now, you wouldn't make a flag of this size in this room. This is the office where all the business is done. The actual work on the flag was done upstairs in her bedroom, and that's where we're going next. The idea for the flag actually originated with Major George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry. Armistead believed his men were ready to defend against the enemy, but they had no suitable ensign, he said, to display over the fort. Armistead wanted a flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. He, in 1813, along with others, placed the order for the gargantuan flag. The first was a small storm flag, for which Mary received $168.54. She received $405.90 for the larger garrison flag, and that larger flag is the flag we think of today when we think of the Star-Spangled Banner. The work was done in here, in Mary's bedroom. She lived here with her mother, her daughter, and as many as 6 other people, including at least one slave whose name, unfortunately, has been lost to history. Most of the women in this house took at least some hand in making these flags, namely that larger garrison flag. It was contracted to be 30 feet high and 42 feet wide, and when it was all said and done, that flag could not have fit across the floor plan of this entire building, much less in this small room. In fact, at one point, the flag and its work had to be taken across the street to a brewery so they could finish working on it. That brewery, unfortunately, no longer stands today. But when the work was done, these 2 flags were delivered to the garrison at Fort McHenry, and the smaller flag flew during the bombardment on September 13, 1814. That larger flag, however, was the flag that was raised over the fort when the bombardment was over and inspired Francis Scott Key to write our national anthem. In addition to the historic house, people can also visit the museum complex behind me. There you can learn more about the makers of the flag and see some artifacts related to the actual flag itself, including the original receipt received by Mary Pickersgill. So if you ever do make it down to Baltimore, I highly recommend you check out the Star-Spangled Banner House and the museum. It's a really wonderful addition to your trip. Now let's head over to Fort McHenry and see where this flag flew. If people know anything about Fort McHenry, they at least think of the flag at Fort McHenry. So tell us a little bit about the role the flag plays here at Fort McHenry.
Absolutely. That is the one thing people know about Fort McHenry is the flag or the ramparts. So the flag that's flying today, because the storm flag that's flying right now, is actually the size that flew throughout the bombardment. The garrison flag, the big one, what we call the big flag, the 30 by 42 is raised up the next morning. So this size flag was actually flying throughout the night, throughout the whole battle. And it's rain soaked and they bring it down the next morning. And you remember that moment when they're playing Yankee Doodle and they raise up the garrison flags. So the broad stripes, the bright stars climbing over the ramparts. Key sees that. And throughout that night, he had been looking for some indication of who was winning or how the battle was playing out. And so the next morning when he says, "Oh, say, can you see?" It's actually a question. A lot of people don't notice the question mark, but it's there. And he's asking, can you see the flag that was flying last night? Paraphrase it, just doesn't sound as elegant, but that's what he's asking, and he's looking for some indication, and what he gets at 9 o'clock is the first shot of the morning gun, and then he doesn't hear the field music, but he does see the 2-foot high stripes and the broad stars climbing above the fort. That's the garrison flag that you'll see at the Smithsonian.
So just stepping back a minute, why are there 2 flags and why are they 2 different sizes?
Oh, okay, well that's basically just like many military installations, you're going to find the answer is boring and practical. So we have the garrison flag, which was made in 1813. George Armistead requested it. He wanted a 30 by 42 foot garrison flag that the British would have no difficulty seeing from a distance. So if we think about that, earlier on we were talking about how George Armistead was preparing the garrison. He was preparing. And so keep in mind, throughout that time, the Royal Navy is sailing throughout the Chesapeake Bay. So he wanted a flag where if a British ship approached the city of Baltimore, they would look and they would see his garrison flag flying over Fort McHenry and know that there was a fort there. So kind of as a deterrent, but also a really big flag was good for morale. It built up morale amongst his men. So that's the larger one. Now, a storm flag, the 17 by 25, well, it's kind of what it says. It's a storm flag. It's supposed to be flown in adverse weather. So for us, we think of this as the smaller flag of the 2, and it is for purely practical reasons. So that's the one that's up throughout the night.
So when he decides to put up the garrison flag, is it because it's the clean one, or is he really kind of try to stick it to the British to say, "Ha ha, we're still here"?
It's actually a symbol of defiance. And when we think about this, if you try and imagine that moment, the men who were here, the ones who were on the ramparts, who were on the water batteries, who were in the garrison and around it, they have been withstanding a bombardment for over 25 hours. There are 1,500 explosive shells fired right over their heads, and many exploding near them. So that's their morning, right? It's smoke-filled, and then the people in Baltimore are listening to all of this because the sound of the bombardment of Fort McHenry actually carried as far as Philadelphia. So if you can imagine the folks who are at home listening this, now they're related to a lot of the men who are serving here. So they're looking toward the fort in anticipation, wondering, they're asking, if you hear the guns stop, if you hear the firing stop, that silence is telling you something, but you still don't know what the answer is. And so George Armistead's flag provides that answer. And it's also meant as a symbol of defiance because it tells people as they see it, and you can actually see the garrison flag from just across the harbor. So those men who were at Hampstead Hill could see the garrison flag. Go to Patterson Park today, you can still see it. So when they saw that, they realized, well, the fort's still standing, right? So there's that realization that we're actually going to make it through this. And so that's the feeling that's being conveyed, is the idea that the fort's still there. But if you're one of the men here and you're looking just beyond these ramparts at the Royal Navy, and keep in mind that's the Royal Navy that just defeated Napoleon. Right. So they're the guys, right? If you're looking at them and you've been here for 25 hours and endured this long bombardment, and instead of they're expecting you to capitulate. They're expecting you to throw in the towel. But instead of that, the fort fires one shot and then raises its garrison flag. The signal that Admiral Cochrane is getting as his squadron decides to leave is, we're still here. And so that's the message that Armistead sends. So it is a little daring to taunt the Royal Navy, but that's the message he sent, is one of determination and one of defiance, of saying, we're not going anywhere.
So Key sees this flag and is inspired by it. So would you say that's kind of what Armistead intended all along?
I don't know if it's what he intended. Armistead and Key don't necessarily know each other, but the message behind it, that idea of endurance, of that his men had been there throughout that entire thing, withstood the entire bombardment, that the city would be around, that it wasn't going to be destroyed by the British. That is something that inspires Key, yes, and it's the message that Armistead is sending.
And not only will the city still be there, but the country will still be there too. And I think that's kind of the message we want to take away from Fort McHenry, is that no matter what, we are going to endure as a nation, no matter whether it's bombardments or anything else that might come our way.
Yeah, that's actually the message that when Key describes his song, he says later on in his life, he says, let the praise be given not to me, but to the inspirers of the song. And so usually when visitors stop by, I'll ask them, what's the Star-Spangled Banner about? And, folks are, well, I'm not sure it's about a flag. What it's really about is the defenders and the dedication and the determination and the grit that they demonstrated throughout that night. So Key's writing about those men and what they do to protect their community. So if we take that message and we broaden it out beyond just Baltimore in 1814, the Star-Spangled Banner is about unifying around a community to preserve it.
I'm joined now by Ray Snyder, a park guide here at Fort McHenry National Monument and Shrine. Ray, can you tell us, most Americans have heard of Francis Scott Key. Who was Francis Scott Key?
Francis Scott Key was a lawyer from Georgetown, the Georgetown section of Washington, D.C.
Now, he's connected here to the Battle of Fort McHenry. How exactly is he connected?
He's connected. He had gone out to secure the release of a friend who had been taken by the British.
Now, who was this friend and how did he get captured by the British?
His name was Dr. William Beans. When the British marched towards Washington from southern Maryland off the Patuxent River, in Upper Marlborough, they stopped at the house of a man named Dr. William Beans. Dr. Beans hosts them. He feeds them, gives them some wine. And the next morning when they go to leave, the British officers under the command of Major General Robert Ross secure an oath from Dr. Beans not to interfere in British military operations. Dr. Beans says, hey, not a problem, I can do that. So the British leave, the Battle of Bladensburg occurs, The British go into Washington and burn the public buildings, and then they leave, go past Dr. Bean's house. When Dr. Bean sees them go past the house on their way back to the fleet, he figures, well, I'm not under any obligation anymore. And so a few hours later, some other British soldiers, stragglers, come by asking for food or drink, and he and some friends take them to a local jail. And then one of them says, I want a dessert, can you help me? And Dr. Bean says, sure, not a problem.
So he goes from helping the British to putting a few of them in jail,
Yes.
to then helping one of them dessert.
Yes.
How does that get him in prison?
It gets him in prison because they didn't leave any guards at that prison. At the prison where they secured the British stragglers. So one of them goes down to the fleet and tells one of the officers that this mean old Dr. Beans put us in jail for no reason, and now is encouraging the men to desert. Word of this gets back to General Ross, who feels that Dr. Beans has betrayed his word as a gentleman, and Dr. Beans and two other men actually are seized at Dr. Beans' house and put in the hold of a British ship. The two other men are released, and they come back in southern Maryland around Upper Marlboro, and they tell everybody that Dr. Beans has been taken by the British, and they're going to take him up to Halifax and try him for interfering with British operations.
And at this point, this is where Francis Scott Key comes in?
He's an acquaintance of, as he refers to, Old Beans, and so he, knowing the law, he volunteers to go help Dr. Beans and gets permission from President Madison to help secure Beans' release. And then Key goes to Bladensburg, where there were wounded British prisoners, and says, I'm going out to the fleet. Does anybody have letters for home? Secures a sack of letters, and then comes back into Baltimore, and where the Inner Harbor is today, he gets on board a ship with a guy named John Skinner, who's the U.S. prisoner of exchange agent, and they sailed down to the Chesapeake Bay and encounter the British fleet.
And so we now have this civilian, a lawyer, bringing letters from British wounded soldiers back to the British fleet. He gets to the British fleet and hops on board a British ship. Then what happens?
Naval officer in charge, Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, is having a meal, and another admiral, Vice Admiral George Coburn, has met with Skinner many times, so they're actually sitting having a meal. And the argument starts to break out, and Skinner realizes there's this officer he hasn't met before. And so this officer is General Ross. General Ross invites Skinner back to his cabin and says, listen, I know why you're here. Dr. Beans does not deserve to be released. He's not a gentleman. I wouldn't even let the sailors talk to him. He goes, but I have read the sack of letters, and I am very grateful to the treatment that my men have been given. So for that reason and that reason alone, I will consent to release Dr. Beans. Cochrane puts them back on their own ship. It's tied to the British command ship, and they go, hey, listen, let's put us back on our ship. Let us go. And Cochrane says, no, I can't do that because we've been discussing the plans, and we're sure you've heard everything we've had to say. So if we just let you go, you're going to go back to Baltimore and, if you'll pardon the pun, spill all the beans. That's not what Cochrane says, but that's what he means. You just go back and just tell everybody what we've said.
And so by that point, the British plan is to what exactly?
The British are going to land so we're at Fort McHenry. If you look down the Patapsco River, it goes about another 10 miles down beyond there. They're going to land on the peninsula, march up along here, and try to take Baltimore. So on the 12th, there's a battle at North Point where the British are held up. General Ross is killed. The Americans retreat into Baltimore, where there is a massive fortification called Hampstead Hill with about 12,000 soldiers. The British look at that and go, you know what? We're not going to be able to take this. We're going to need the Navy to come past Fort McHenry and bomb these entrenchments. So Francis Scott Key is, when the British fleet comes up, he is part of the fleet that comes up. About 17 ships are going to be right out here. He's tied to the British command ship. And that bridge that you see there, that bridge is 4 miles away. Key is 3 miles away and over towards the left. You see that island out there? That's Fort Carroll. He's about a mile in from there. So he's watching the entire bombardment for that 25 hours.
So he's there for 25 hours while shells and bombs are flying back and forth, tied to the British command ship. This is a pretty harrowing experience, I imagine.
I would think so. I certainly wouldn't want to have been in those shoes.
And so when the bombardment ceases, what happens to Key then?
All right, so when the bombardment ceases, Key is wondering why had the British stopped firing. It had rained very heavily during the battle. The flag that was on the flagpole was a small 17 by 25 foot flag made of wool. So by the time the battle stops on the morning of September 14th, 1814, that flag is going to be hanging limp against the flagpole because it's soaked up so much water. So they can't see the flag, and they're wondering why had the British stopped firing. It could mean only one of two things: they're getting ready to sail away, or they've taken Baltimore, and Key doesn't know which one it is. So for an hour and a half, Key and the other men on the ship, Skinner and the rest of the crew of that ship, are looking for the flag, and they can't see it because the flag is hanging limp against the flagpole because of the rain clouds from the storm. So they're going, "Can you see the flag? Can you say, can you see?" They're asking the other men, "Can you see the flag?" Also, there's a fog coming up off the river, called the mist of the deep, as Key refers to it. Now, Key does not know that the British have been told we're going to leave, and at 9 o'clock, be prepared to sail. So at 9 o'clock, as they're still watching, here in the fort, right where the flagpole is, the big 30 by 42 foot garrison flag is hoisted, as ordered by Major George Armistead. And a cannon, which would have been right behind where I am now, is a signal gun. Every morning at 9 o'clock, they change the flag, they fire the signal gun. Well, just at that time, as Key is watching, that flag is to the top of the flagpole, the clouds disperse. The smoke blows away, and the sun comes out and shines on that flag. Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam. In full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, long may it wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. That's most of the second verse. That's what he's writing about, and he describes that moment for us in what he called a poem, even though he meant it as a song because he's got the tune in his head.
So he wrote it with the tune in mind?
With the tune in his head. He had already used that tune called "An Act Ground in Heaven." He had used that in 1805 for a song called "When the Warrior Returns," about Stephen Decatur coming back from the Barbary Wars.
Key is famous for having watched this bombardment, seen the flag, written this poem that we now know as our national anthem. Did he ever actually come here to Fort McHenry where the flag flew?
There's no evidence he ever came to Fort McHenry at all. He didn't feel he needed to, probably. He just wanted to get home. He goes into Baltimore, goes that night on the 16th, writes out the 4 verses, has them published the next day, and a handbill which is handed out to a lot of the soldiers here. He actually had a brother-in-law here as one of the defenders. On September 17th, the handbill is distributed in Baltimore, and here, actually it's September 18th, distributed here at Fort McHenry.
Well, Francis Scott Key never came here to Fort McHenry, but I encourage you to come out here, see the flagpole where this flag flew, and then see Fort Carroll over there, and imagine all those British warships standing out there, and put yourself in Francis Scott Key's shoes and imagine witnessing this great moment in American history. Thanks a lot, Ray.
You're very welcome.
So Shannon, we've seen a lot of what there is to do at the fort here, but what makes visitors excited to come to Fort McHenry?
Well, one of the things that's important about all the National Park Service sites is the power of place. It's one thing to read about something in a book. It's very, very different to actually stand on the ground. And for you, you were just standing on the water battery where this took place, to really relive the experiences of those who come before us. And so any park that you go to where you can stand on the ground and look out at the view shed, for here you're looking out across the river, or back at the fort, you get a sense of actually what took place, and you get a sense of the stories that inspire us now, because the bravery, the determination we talked about from 1814 is something that we carry with us now into whatever challenges face us as a community. So coming here puts you back in touch with those stories, and when people come here, they can take part in a ranger program like you did, or you can join us when they're on the guns, or raise the flag here. There are a lot of ways that you can interact with the place and be in the park and in the moment from 1814 and for many time periods here. You can also get your junior ranger badge. For a lot of folks here, they just come to spend time in it's also a park. So folks come here just to relax and to recreate a little bit, but there's definitely a lot of history to learn here. So it's worth stopping by and connecting with that.
If you had one thing that you think a visitor should experience in this park, what would it be?
It's raising the flag. That's always been a fun thing for me. Even when I was a volunteer, the first time I put the garrison flag up was a really cool experience. And because you're actually reliving that moment from over 200 years ago, especially when you have the music with you, you can really get a sense of what that moment must have been like. So that's a really fun thing for me to experience. I love the gun drill too, but usually it's giving the orders and explaining it. But yeah, helping to raise the flag over Fort McHenry, I mean, you know, how much historic can you get?
Is there any experience that you can have here at the park that people don't expect, that kind of surprises them?
Gosh, I'm really not sure what we've had some folks who they come in, particularly with the War of 1812. A lot of folks come in and they're a blank slate when it comes to the War of 1812. It's not something they're familiar with. I'm delighted to see them because they're eager to learn. And so they're surprised at the types of stories they can find. We have people who come in and they didn't realize that African Americans played a critical role in the War of 1812, particularly in the Chesapeake campaign. They didn't, you know, you guys learned today what a field musician actually does. They start to learn about what life was like and for civilians and what it was like to have, you know, the Royal Navy in your backyard, basically. Fortunately, as a nation, we haven't had to experience that kind of threat that close to us. And to see how a community pulled together back then is really a remarkable story, and people start to learn that the Star-Spangled Banner is not really about the flag, it's about the story behind it, the people who made sure that it continued to fly.
Well, Shannon, thank you for sharing all that, and thank you for showing us around the fort today.
Thanks for coming out. Glad to have you.
We're now here in Washington, D.C. at the National Museum of American History. This museum is the home to more than 3 million artifacts of American history and culture. But the most important, in my opinion, is the Star-Spangled Banner. After the Battle of Fort McHenry, the Star-Spangled Banner remained in the possession of George Armistead's family, and he kept it, his daughter Georgiana kept it, and then passed it on to her son, Eben Appleton. And it was only then, in 1907, that Appleton is going to try and find a permanent home for this piece of American history. He's going to find it here at the Smithsonian, and in 1907 gift it to the Smithsonian Institute. In the centuries since Appleton gave the flag to the Smithsonian, it has been displayed in a number of different ways. First in the castle, and then in different displays here in this museum over the years. The current display right now is its final resting place inside a climate-controlled building with low light, so you can really see and appreciate this flag for generations to come. When you do come to Washington, D.C., make sure you come here and see this flag and see the Star-Spangled Banner in all of its glory. So as you can see, there is quite a bit of history here in Baltimore, specifically from the War of 1812. We toured one of the area's prominent homes and talked about the people who helped make Baltimore an epicenter for trade in North America and a prime target for the British military. We also talked about the women who made, literally, the flag that inspired our national anthem. And of course, we've toured Fort McHenry, where by the dawn's early light, that flag proclaimed that our nation would stand in the face of the greatest adversity. On behalf of our friends at the National Park Service, the Star-Spangled Banner Flag House, the Peter Bowie and Barbara Stewart Foundation, and of course, the members of the American Battlefield Trust, thank you for watching.